You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. The next two episodes are going to be a bit different from what you've heard on this show before, mostly because the theme merits bringing together a host of voices, not only one at a time, and not only my own. I was able to dig into an aspect of local culture that has major implications globally, and that is also part of a broader industry in dire need of change and regulation. What could I possibly be talking about? Fashion. And it's the perfect time to explore this since Paris is once again hosting another Fashion Week. Every season, all eyes are on the Parisian runways as onlookers try to get a peek at what big and disruptive trends await for the following year. But few people know about the history of how this industry came to be, the role of colonialism in its development, and how the industry upholds many of the same ideas and practices today. As you will discover, the legacy of colonialism lives on within the fashion industry and not only in France. You're going to hear from a fashion historian, environmental journalists, and activists over the course of the next two episodes who will help me unpack the darker side to la mode, why it's crucial to amend old ways and correct for generations of unethical labor and overproduction, and what the idea of decolonizing fashion really means. Now with that, let's jump right in to part one. For nearly 500 years, France has been the global fashion leader. As of the late 17th century, that was particularly true in Paris, as the city became universally recognized as the source of fine taste and, by extension, held up as the fashion capital in Europe. That can largely be attributed to Louis XIV and his court at Versailles, the birthplace of haute couture. According to fashion historian Kimberly Chrisman Campbell, in a piece she wrote for The Atlantic, the fashion capital of the world wasn't actually Paris when Louis took the throne in 1643, but Madrid. She wrote, "Tastes tend to follow power, and for the past 2 centuries or so, Spain had been enjoying its golden age, amassing a vast global empire that fueled a booming domestic economy. Spanish taste, then, was the gold standard, adopted by nearly all European courts, including in France. And the French aristocrats weren't only importing their fashions, but tapestries from Brussels, lace from Venice, and silk from Milan." Chrisman Campbell wrote that France didn't have much choice in the matter as the country wasn't producing luxury goods of a comparable quality, and it didn't have the political, economic, or cultural clout to dictate fashions to other countries. Well, all of that changed when King Louis XIV came to power. During his reign, about 1/3 of Parisian wage earners were employed in clothing and textiles. The king's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, set these workers up into regulated professional guilds and established quality control. Supposedly, nothing that could be made in France was allowed to be imported at all at the time. And of course, there was also a strict dress code for the royal court and rules on etiquette that effectively guaranteed a market for French-made clothing and jewelry. Mass production of clothing truly began shortly thereafter, particularly with the production of uniforms for the Army and Navy. This was further helped along by the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the steam engine, and then much later, in 1830, the first sewing machine. The idea of introducing new textiles seasonally, then only twice a year, that would reflect the country's changing climate also came out of the king's court. And that's a frequency that has continued and even increased ever since. Above all, what was most novel during this time, according to the Oxford historian William H. Sewell, was the role of the consumers themselves in the social construction of fashion. In one of his papers entitled The Empire of Fashion and the Rise of Capitalism in 18th Century France, he wrote that what was new in the late 17th and 18th centuries was the pronounced taste for novelty itself and the gradual democratization of status through consumption. In this Paris-centered fashion system, old clothing and accessories lost value quickly. Fashion-conscious consumers wished to have new, up-to-the-minute styles. This meant that they had to replenish their wardrobes much more quickly and that they would pass out-of-date clothing along to poorer consumers, especially to their servants, who would thereby enter into the lower levels of the fashion systems themselves. So what we have is basically the makings of the modern fashion industry as we know it, with an emphasis on consumption and novelty, craftsmanship, and cheap labor. And that labor initially included impoverished French manual laborers and eventually those in French and other European colonies, and allowed for the extraction of materials such as cotton from India. Of course, there's another important piece of understanding the industry, and that's cultural appropriation. I spoke with Kemaïs Ben Lakhtar, a fashion historian, lecturer, and doctoral candidate at Paris 1 La Sorbonne, who argues in his research that the production of haute couture necessarily fed the imperialist viewpoint and is deeply intertwined with cultural appropriation. And what about cultural appropriation? Because this is sort of the other element to this story, which is that, from the time of the royals, they're bringing back these prints and reappropriating them, again, without giving proper credit. But that is still a problem that we've seen over the years with very big brands. Louis Vuitton has done it. Isabelle Marant has done it. More recently, Cézanne has done it. So is that part of what keeps us and keeps the industry in this more imperialistic phase?
Definitely. And this is all the hypothesis, one of the hypotheses of my PhD. And I'm preparing a book focusing on this question. It's going to publish in few months. And I'm trying to address the question of cultural appropriation in terms of history. And because I'm an art historian and a fashion historian, and to try to explore how systemic and how cultural appropriation could be for the relation to creativity in the French industry. And to me, cultural appropriation, it's not about a conjuncture, about an ephemeral moment in time. It's about a structure. I'm trying to demonstrate in my PhD that the expansion of the French Empire and its imperialistic point of view on the world has to be directly linked with the production of haute couture. So the couturier, in a moment when the empire began to establish themselves all around the world, we can see that the couturier did exactly the same. They began to appropriate a lot of material culture all around the world, and they use it as if they create it. And they were also awarded for that because the client wanted novelty. They wanted something new and they wanted a lot of exotic artifacts. And so this is the law of the market. They were encouraged to appropriate non-Western culture in order to propose new forms in their haute couture collection, etc. So to me, cultural appropriation is rooted in the very creative process of the contemporary fashion system.
You use the word exotic, which is very interesting and a very choice word because there's this exoticism of the former colonies and accessing materials that they couldn't have here. I mean, they're not getting cotton from France. They're not getting patterns, some of these patterns from here. So is the answer that we go back to sort of, we go to our seamstress who uses simple materials that grow locally? What do you think the answer is to
try to avoid cultural appropriation?
Well, not just that, but also the way the extraction of resources, the fact that the gaze is constantly placed on from the global north to the detriment of the global south.
That's interesting that you stressed out in your question the word exotic, because exotic is such an Eurocentric way to define what is non-Western. I don't have an answer to your question. I think it's complicated to give like advices. I think, as I said, it's structural. So I think that the first thing to say is to address frontally the question and to decolonize it frontally. And I think that from this very point, everything's gonna change.
We'll come back to the specifics of the idea of decolonization in the next episode, but what Camille touched on is something other historians have crystallized about this time period. Fashion was a symbol of France's sophisticated culture. Texts, letters, and documents written in the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th centuries characterized the country's colonies as quote-unquote primitive societies that supplied raw materials for French industries and then turned those materials into French products that would eventually be sold back to or dumped in the very continent they originated from. In a paper called Colonialism's Clothing, Professor Victoria Rovine, who teaches at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, argued that whether in Southeast Asia or West Africa, France's colonies were sources of styles and forms that would be absorbed and authenticated in the hands of French designers and artists. One article on the 1931 World's Exposition noted, "An infusion of exoticism is constantly necessary for our Old West. Our civilization regularly tries to rejuvenate itself by plunging into a bath of primitive life." Drawing from, borrowing, or appropriating textiles and patterns from their colonies, France presented fashions at that very well-attended World's Fair as a means of reinforcing French cultural superiority and the dominance of whiteness. But as the professor also wrote, in official representations of Africa, the betterment of the colonial subject was marked by progress toward Western-style dress. In other words, when the colonial subject abandoned traditional or tribal attire, it was meant to be seen as an achievement for Africa. And that was also meant to garner support among French citizens for France's colonial project. In reality, you can see this in more than just fashion. I mean, look at art. Anything they could do to rationalize colonial activity was worthy. And according to another academic, Michelle Tolini-Finamore, promoting the colonies as a source of aesthetic inspiration and raw materials for consumer products was one way of going about it. After World War II, cotton became the go-to material, which was sourced far from France, and consumption then accelerated further. The very trade routes that were used under colonialism to exchange labor, resources, and goods are actually the same ones used today by the fashion industry. And those trade routes not only hurt people in the global South, but hurt the environment too. In her book Consumed, published in 2020, sustainability activist and author Aja Barber explores the links between colonialism and modern Western supply chains. In it, she urges her readers to opt out of participating in the consumerist hamster wheel. Here's what she had to say when we spoke about those trade routes.
The same trade routes that were used in the 16 and 1700s are still, definitely used today. And when I talk about the past, I'm talking about moments in time like chattel slavery or British exploration in India. Chattel slavery was a huge part of kickstarting the Industrial Revolution. And when we talk about, cotton, and we learn about chattel slavery in school, we really don't connect it to clothing in this weird way. We look at it as like a resource, but we don't think about that without the roots of slavery all over the world, we wouldn't have today's fashion industry. And so it's important to remember that the two are intrinsically connected. And yes, obviously, a lot of things were looted, whether it be gold or spices, but cotton was also something that was heavily sought after. When people talk about, for instance, it's a good job in this country in reference to parts of Asia where our clothing manufacturing is done and people are treated poorly and paid pennies, they're forgetting that in the past, a lot of these countries were the superpower of clothing production, and colonialism was all about disrupting that and taking that power away. And we've been taught from this colonialist idea that everybody wants our scraps, which is just inherently something we have to unpick because it's pretty grim. So when we donate our clothing, charity shops in general can only sell 10% of it. So the other 90% is going to get dumped somewhere, and it's either going to be in a landfill, which Dr. Robert E. Bullart's work proved that landfills in the United States were being put close to brown and black neighborhoods. So it might end up in a landfill, but a lot of it is going to end up in countries in the global south where it completely pollutes the environment there. It doesn't just pollute the environment, it ruins the local trade because it undercuts the local makers. In a place like Ghana, Cantonmonto Market gets something like 15 million garments a week coming into their doors, and they're not able to sell 15 million garments when the population, I want to say, is 30 million. Anyways, they're not selling all of that, which means that their municipal dump has filled up 10 years ahead of schedule. And what that also means is that the clothing just flows everywhere. It's in neighborhoods, it's on the beach, it's everywhere, and it's pollution. It's not helping anyone. It's not lifting anyone out of poverty. It's certainly not dressing anyone well. It's pollution. And Ghanaians have done an amazing job of making some lemonade out of a lemon. When you look at a system like Cantonmonto, it's such a thriving marketplace of, innovation. You have tailors, you have dyers, you have people that do trim. So you could essentially buy a garment that might not fit you well, and you could go around to different places and get that garment so that's actually perfect for you, which is amazing. That's what all of our high streets should look like. But instead, our high streets look like multi-billion-dollar companies selling us tat that's essentially linear use because our system is linear and not circular.
Whether we're talking about French luxury or haute couture brands or high street brands of fast fashion, what unites each of these facets of the industry is a problem with how the whole business operates writ large. So what would it mean for the Parisian and global fashion industry to be sustainable? If we go by the UN's definition of sustainability, effectively a buzzword that has been co-opted by brands for greenwashing or doing the bare minimum to improve their practices, it would mean this. It would mean balancing economic, social, and environmental considerations. A sustainable fashion industry is one that is resource efficient and renewable resources based, producing non-toxic, high quality, and affordable clothing while providing safe and secure livelihoods. I'd add to that, it's also one that is fully transparent and able to track every stage of a garment's creation, so that we as consumers know that the workers are paid well, treated well, and work in safe conditions. This clip from a conversation on Al Jazeera between writer-activist Asad Rehman and Aja Barber, who you just heard from, sums it up beautifully.
I want that sustainability to be, are you doing your fair share on the climate crisis? Are you limiting your material use? Are you tackling inequality? Are you repairing the historical injustice and exploitation? If you are, that's sustainable. If you're not, then you're part of the problem.
One of the big problems is that they managed to separate human rights and sustainability. It was like, well, we care about the planet, we just don't care about the workers. Exactly. But it is a sustainable garment, and you can't separate that. They're intrinsically linked.
So is the supply chain in any of the fashion capitals sustainable, equitable, transparent, or environmentally minded? The environmental journalist Esha Chabra says, not yet, but change is happening.
In general, the problem is that the supply chains are so global in fashion that a lot of companies don't have true transparency and don't know where all their materials are coming from. It's improving, but it's improving very, very slowly. And that's the big challenge. You have brands that'll make claims like we use organic cotton. Fantastic. Do you know where that organic cotton is coming from? Can you actually even just trace it back to the area? Forget the farm, because maybe that's too detailed, but just even the region. Not necessarily. And we've seen now in certain materials like cotton, for example, there's been a fair amount of corruption that goes on. So you have the mixing of non-organic and organic cotton blending and then being sold off as organic cotton. So to avoid all of that, you really need to understand your supply chain. A lot of the brands, the high street brands, the fast fashion brands, their headquarters are in Europe or in the US or North America, but most of the manufacturing is taking place elsewhere, whether it's in Asia or South America or, even Africa. And there's a real disconnect there. I have seen firsthand some brands have really small core teams that are focused on sourcing or sustainability, and they just can't be everywhere. They can't be at every step of the supply chain. So they're relying on partners on the ground. It's not like they have boots on the ground. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when you do buy a garment, there's so many steps involved. So even if it's a simple t-shirt, the cotton comes from somewhere. It's taken to a ginning and spinning facility somewhere else. It's taken to a cut and sew facility somewhere else. And there's, possibly continents being involved in that supply chain. It's not just within one region.
Is it true that there's also a question of data, right? So because they're not these, different aspects of the production or people who work for these brands are not necessarily going on the ground, they don't actually have accurate data to measure how bad their emissions are or how unethical their wages are for workers. I mean, is that sort of a key element to what these brands are also going to need to do? I mean, accessing data, but then also being more present in the places where their stuff is made?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's two sides to this coin, and I think Alden Wicker, she does a great job. She's a journalist in the US of like talking about how the data is so flawed in this space. Even when I was doing research for the book, there were statistics that I wanted to use, but you try to trace them back and you're like, where does this come from? Like, who's coming up with this statistic? And it's really hard to actually find the origin of some of these stats. So yeah, I mean, some of them are clearly estimates. I don't think that there is clear data to inform those numbers. But the other side of it is also that companies have started to do life cycle analysis. Companies have started to do these kind of processes that do form better data. But what are they doing with that data next? That's sort of the other issue. It's like, okay, great. So we have some data to work off of, but now what are we going to do with this? And also there's been a move away from just throwing out their greenwashing statements to now using like scope 1, 2, 3, this approach where you reduce your own greenhouse emissions internally before you turn to carbon offsets. So that's been, I think, a good step. It's a step in the right direction where brands are saying, okay, wait, we need to first measure like what actually is our own footprint at different steps of our operations, from HQ all the way down to supply chains, and then start to work on that before we jump on the carbon offset bandwagon, because that's a whole other conversation.
So where does that leave us now? As Tiffany Dark put it in her excellent newsletter called It's Not Sustainable, the fashion industry can't just shut down overnight. It needs to evolve and progress, radically and at pace. But if we all stopped buying and selling fashion, over 60 million workers worldwide would be out of a job. I would also say the reality is this. You can make the supply chain as sustainable as you want with ethical labor standards, fair wages, non-toxic and energy-intensive materials, but at the end of the day, the rate that we're consuming things is unsustainable. The entire business model, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, even in the 18th century, is based on want and creating desire, a desire for novelty, surely to address a hole in our lives that we've been told can be filled by shopping. Catherine Dauriac, the president of the French outpost of Fashion Revolution, a global NGO that focuses on environmental and human rights issues within the fashion industry, says you simply can't disconnect the climate calamity and unethical labor practices that the fashion industry contributes to from overproduction, overconsumption, and waste pollution. Here's part of our conversation.
The main issue is overproduction. Production is not made in France, a little bit, but very, very few. Everything comes from Asia, Turkey, Ethiopia, a little bit from Europe, but Eastern Europe, we have producer country, of course, but it's a very few. The most of the production comes from China, Bangladesh, the two first producers in the world. But what is the problem? Overproduction conducts to overconsumption. And the problem is overconsumption. We consume 2 or 3 times more clothes than 10 years ago. Why? Because of hypermediatization, publicity, influencers, trends like that. Trends. Which trends? I ask it because what is trend? Everybody in the street is wearing the same clothes, so I don't understand. So the problem is the need of regulation about the importation from Asia, importation of clothes, too many clothes, and people buy, then they throw it in the trash, and everything goes in dumps in Africa, in Chile. We have seen the images, so we know that not only Africa, also Madagascar, which is a little part of Africa, but not in the continent, and Haiti. From France, we send to Haiti, a very poor country, and they don't need all that plastic, polyester-based textiles we send to them because they can't wear it because it's dump, it's bullshit, it's nothing, and it's not convenient for their climate because polyester in hot countries is not so comfortable, as we know. And the consequences are serious human health problems and environmental pollution. So it's a question of human rights, public health, and moral health, ethics.
And that's not even talking about the people who are making the clothes, right? I mean, this is just about here the clothes exist, they've been overproduced, but you also in your work look at the rights for the people who are making the clothes, right?
Yeah, the people who are making the clothes are paid very low wages. There's child labor, forced labor, slave labor. It's not possible. If you think about the cost of a garment, nobody knows how a garment is made nowadays.
So people are disconnected from reality.
No, it's a big problem. Yeah, we are totally disconnected. Yes, of course.
So,
but it's ethics.
It's ethics. Yeah.
What I love that the question I asking my student, what is the civilization you want to live in? Just that. Just stop a little bit and think about it. What civilization do we want to live in? Slave people working for us, child labor? No. In the 21st century? Come on.
But what do we do about all this? What are the actual next steps, ideologically and practically? It seems that France and its companies have the artisanal know-how to make quality goods, but it's as if they think the work stops there. What about collective obligation to the broader good? What about their responsibility to ensure their ways of working don't turn a blind eye to the people their production may hurt or impact? According to many journalists, activists, and industry insiders, the answer may be decolonization. Next up, I'm going to talk about that, the role of policy, and some pretty tangible steps that we can all take globally. Make sure you're subscribed to and following the New Paris podcast wherever you listen so you know when part 2 drops. Until then, à bientôt.